there are lots of people who are post-operative trans who try and cultivate the notion that they were never the opposite sex, and they try and erase history. And it's almost like, if I can convince everyone around me to believe something, then it must be true. Because in a democracy, the majority is right. So if I can convince everyone that this is reality, then this is reality because they're the majority.
Gosh.
And they do that on an unconscious level. And there's an activist who was a doctor and is a female to male trans and denies ever being female. Yet, if you look at old Twitter posts, there's her showing off mastectomy scars. So, very interesting.
Just liars, I think. I mean, that's just lying, isn't it? And so we don't actually know the percentage who regrets, and we never really can. And also, I've heard that whenever people, like when Richie Herron, who was a guest on this podcast,
he's written a chapter in the book.
Oh, right,
amazing chapter. He's really
great.
Really raw.
He's such a good speaker, and raw. Brilliant. That doesn't surprise me. Well, that's fascinating. And he said, he went back, and they didn't want to know.
So they don't want to know, and a lot of mine said, we don't want to go back because we spent years convincing our GP, our psychiatrist, the gender clinic to give us what we wanted. It's too embarrassing to say, actually, I was wrong. So they don't want to go back. And a lot of them say, what's the point going back? Because they can't stick it back on. They can't change it. So most of them choose not to go back. But they're not followed up with questionnaires or how you're doing. And, I was seeing these people every single week, some of them for 10 years, which is more clinical contact than any other clinician had with them. And I had one who, after seeing me for a year, was completely fine being a man. But he still goes to the gender clinic twice a year. I'd get a letter from the gender clinic referring to him in this female name and saying how happy he was living in this trans role. And I'd say, it's a bit weird. I'm getting these letters from the gender clinic that referring to you in your previous sort of female name and saying you're happy being a woman. And he said, and this was brilliant, he said, we all know I'm happy being a man, but there was a part of me that wanted to be a woman. And now that lives on in the minds of the gender clinic because they believe that I'm living as a woman. And it was almost like this sliding doors other reality. And he was happy being a man, but the unrealistic fantasy of being a woman was now living in the mind of the people in the gender clinic. Even though it wasn't relevant to him, he liked the fact that there, in some reality sphere, in someone's mind, he was.
So he was happy to keep them thinking that.
Yeah. He went twice a year dressed up and convinced them so that in their reality, he was that version.
Wow. Okay. So, I
had another one who's a post-operative person who spent all his day on Facebook having conversations with other people, all of whom were people which were him.
Oh, he was talking to himself?
Yeah, and different personas, different characters.
What, like opening a new tab for each one?
Well, I didn't go into that much detail, but yeah.
Well, you must have asked, how were you doing this? Well, maybe not, actually. You're talking to yourself.
I mean, the fact that he was talking to himself was enough for me.
Was that schizophrenia?
No. It was just creating different realities.
Well, I suppose it's like a diary, or in your creative.
So in the other person who was him's mind, they believed that he was whatever.
Okay.
Or she was whatever. Or,
Okay, I see.
So the manipulation of reality, either in your mind or someone else's mind, even if someone else's is also yours.
Do you see the sadness of it? Do you see people who want to detransition who are coming to you and they can't because you can't stick it back on, and it must be difficult to sit with these people?
So when I started, there were two colleagues who were retiring, and by chance, one of them had run a post-operative regretters group, and one was running a pre-operative group. And the pre-operative group were all very euphoric and idealistic and unrealistic. And the post-op group were in a constant state of mourning. So one was really depressed, one was really unrealistically happy. So I thought, this is a bit of a false division. Why are we dividing people based on whether they've chopped their genitals off or not? So I mixed them together, and it worked really well. That was the perfect formula, because you had people who were idealizing about this Bond girl that they were going to be. Mm. And then you had the detransitions going, hang on a minute, you sound just like I sounded 10 years ago. Honestly, it's not like that. And because the analysis was done by the whole group, they weren't just waiting turns for smarty pants as to say something. It was analysis of each other. they would say, hang on a minute, you sound like me, but you sound completely mad. And coming from each other, that's fine and more powerful than coming from a smarty pants me.
That's how you de-radicalize, isn't it?
So the winning formula, I always said, is a analytic group with a mixture of pre-op, post-op regretters, detransistors, autogynephiles, and transvestites, because there's so much overlap, and let them do the work with a conductor who's neutral. And it's just about thinking. And in the 12 years that I did it, less than 2% of my patients went on to have any medical, physical interventions.
And what would be a typical number?
Typical number?
Typical percentage of people who want to have it done?
Well, no one knows, but these are all people who started off thinking they did.
Okay. Yeah,
so 98% didn't.
A lot of parents will be listening to this, and you're absolutely right. I mean, in any kind of culture circumstance, you want someone who's part of that in-group who might regret it, but parents don't really have access to a detransitioner to speak to their kid. What can they do?
Get them to read the book. I mean, literally a third of this book are the life stories from the people themselves who've changed their mind. The thing about schools is the only training that teachers get are from captured organisations like Mermaid and Stonewall. Mm-hmm. And I talk to parents, and unfortunately, the worst schools for being captured are the private girls' schools, because the state schools come under Ofsted, and Ofsted were being quite sensible, trying to stamp out all this nonsense. But the private schools don't come under Ofsted. And I had a patient whose daughter was in a very, very, very reputable girls' private school in London, and she was saying, I'm telling the school not to refer to my daughter as he, but they're refusing. But if it's any consolation, she's sitting next door to someone who identifies as a cat. On her left, on her right, there's a pterodactyl. And, the idea that you've got a biology teacher that's affirming someone as an extinct animal is ridiculous. But they are, because they're just, once teachers start colluding with you, then everything's gone bonkers.
That's right. And that's historically been right, hasn't it? I mean, Maoist stuff, you talked about the different types.
You read Mao, but haven't read my book.
What?
You've read Mao, but not read my book.
I haven't read Mao. As if I've read Mao.
Well,
I've hardly read anything. I've watched movies that seem to have things that reflect what happened in Maoist China. But I will read your book. But I didn't know you were coming on, and you and my guest book were going back and forward. Yeah, but it was all like, I don't know what time, when am I going to get lunch? Right. We've talked about different types of trans, autogynephiles and transvestites who get a bit of a kick out of it, autistic people. What is going on with those young women at private schools, for example? Because is that also a case of not wanting to grow up because of how they're being sexualized?
There's the two main things that you've got to look at, or three main things with gender dysphoria, are autism, homophobia, and also the subculture stuff, and trauma. That's four things.
Okay, so that trauma fits into...
Yeah, so for females, yes, there's a lot of autism. If they're just young kids, it's often it's a cool thing to be, non-binary goth thing. But a lot of it is lesbophobia. And if you talk to these young people who are girls, who are attracted to girls, and you say, "Oh, so you're a lesbian then?" "No, I'm a trans man." "Oh, do you know any lesbians at school?" "No." "Do you know any famous lesbians?" "No." "Do you know any trans men?" And they reel off all these trans male influences, and they see programs like My Tea Diaries on children's BBC, converting this miserable, otherwise lesbian into this superhero, strong, hairy, trans male. And, would you rather be this thing called a lesbian, which they don't know what it is, or this big, strong trans male? So there's grooming on that front. And I blame the BBC and ITV, all the main channels, because they are massively grooming children. There's all this sort of pro-trans ideology everywhere, but there's nothing critiquing it. There's nothing challenging it. And they're led to believe that, if you like these sorts of things, maybe you should be a man. So, yeah, I think there's a big gap for lesbian positive role models.
This is an issue with what you say about the BBC. I mean, I was in a panel yesterday at the Battle of Ideas about the problems of social media and social media versus the mainstream. And there are absolutely problems with social media. Of course there are. I mean, there's lunatics with huge followings. There are people trying to hide sex crimes while they were celebrities by going religious and going all woo-woo and all that kind of madness. And at the same time, if you only had the BBC and ITV and all of that there would be nothing pushing back against what you're talking about.
Even like, one of the things I hate about the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 is that they've erased the term. I much prefer the term homosexual to gay. I mean, if it's fine to be heterosexual and bisexual, what's wrong with homosexual? Let's awfulify it. Homosexuals would be fine. I mean, gay sounds a bit like a weird brand of jumping.
Do they not say homosexual anymore?
They don't say gay anymore either. So you will not hear them refer to a gay person. They're always LGBTQ people.
Or queer.
BBC is more LGBTQ. And I hate the idea of everyone being grouped together. It's like saying coloured chap or foreigner. Be specific. If you mean, and they're talking about things where there were no T people around. Like, if you're talking about things involving the First World War, there weren't LGBTQ because there weren't any T's in the First World War.
Well, all I'm told is that in the Second World War, that's who Hitler was trying to get. It wasn't the Jews, it was the transsexuals.
They didn't have any transsexuals.
They were all killed.
The first one was 1966, Christian Jorgensen.
Well, apparently they were all killed by the Nazis, and it's only taken this long for them to repopulate.
Well, that's another trans fact that's not really a fact.
Yeah, it does seem to be the case.